we will start. I'm going to turn on the video now, and the recording's on. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining today's ILA Coffee Chat. I'm Monique Bachner, a board member of ILA, and I'll be your host for the next 45 or so minutes. So ILA is the Luxembourg Institute of Directors. It aims to promote best practices in Luxembourg in the field of corporate governance. And in the context particularly of the COVID-19 crisis, ILA has launched this online initiative to help boards identify key topics to be thinking about. Today's session is looking at topics related to boards of listed companies. And we're joined by two experts, both who are very active within governance matters and listed company regulations and laws. Firstly, we have Pierre Margue, who is Secretary to the Board of Directors at SES, a satellite company. Pierre also chaired the corporate governance group at the Stock Exchange for the last revision of the 10 principles of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. You'll hear more about the 10 principles as we go along, as they are the code of conduct applicable to listed companies in Luxembourg. Pierre is also a member of the ILA board and executive committee, and is active in various other ILA roles, such as the nonprofit committee and the listed company committee. Secondly, we have Paula Redondo Pereira. She is head of regulatory affairs at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. She has a legal background and worked at regulators and government roles in Portugal. She tracks legal and regulatory reforms at national, EU, and international levels. And she represents the Luxembourg Stock Exchange in various fora internationally, such as the European Federation of Securities Exchanges and the World Federation of Exchanges, amongst others. Luxembourg Stock Exchange is a corporate member and strong supporter of ILA. So a few house notes. You should all have these down pat now after being on Zoom for several months. Please keep yourselves on and do not unmute. There's a chat button at the bottom of your screen, so you can pop up the chat and ask questions in written format. Please do not ask questions orally. Put them all through the chat channel in written form, and we will try to pick them up as we can as we go along. And the session is being recorded and will be made available online afterwards. So if you are not comfortable with that, feel free to leave or just stay on mute, because then you will not appear popping up. So on that note, let's start and hand over to our panelists. So as we said, today's session is focusing on listed companies. And so I think we'll just start with a wide question to Pierre. Pierre, are there particular issues relating to being listed which have come to the fore during this crisis or over the recent period?
Thank you, Monique. I think that this crisis has affected all the companies big time, and listed companies have been affected mostly in the same way than all other companies. However, because it's very often companies of a bigger size, they may be better prepared insofar as they may have a structure that allows them to communicate better digitally with their stakeholders. Obviously, the big change, and I think we'll get back to that later, I think the big change was in particular with regard to the holding of the shareholder meeting, where in most listed companies that I know, they didn't have, for example, the possibility in their articles to hold digital meetings, and they had to rely on the government's flexibility that allowed them to hold the AGM in a different form. But I think overall it's mostly the same issues that have been that listed companies have had to face.
And Paula,
just with the stock exchange, it's also a very large bond exchange. That's really like, the key feature of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. Any particular, well, perhaps not issues, but, particularities or differences which have come to the fore as a result of the crisis?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for organizing the chat, and thank you for this opportunity to share some views. Good morning, everybody. So I think we can actually tackle this question in two different approaches. First, on a more equity side, and bearing in mind the companies which have shares listed in regulated market, of course that the key principles of corporate governance actually applies. Basically, transparency is key, and regulators were particularly prone to actually emphasize the need of listed companies to comply with all their regulatory obligations. We had, for example, April-March ESMA publishing a very strong statement, which was followed by all national competent authorities regarding the need to listed companies and other market participants to actually comply with their DCP plans, market disclosures, financial disclosures, so complying with market abuse regulation and transparency regulation. So this is key, and despite the pandemic situation, companies actually should make sure that they would comply with their regular obligation, notwithstanding some alleviations in terms of, as Pierre mentioned, AGMs, for example, which could be held on a digital way. So this is more the equity part of the conversation. And then, as you know, Luxembourg Stock Exchange is extremely active on the bond market. And here, of course, that we saw issuers using the bond market to finance themselves, and in the preparation of their prospectus, actually, some important elements were particularly important regarding the prospectus. And here, for example, we observed some particular concerns on the preparation of risk factors, for example, which after the prospectus regulation was a specific section which authorities were particularly concerned, and so all the aspects related to materiality of the risks, the specificity of the risk regarding that particular financing project were focused of concerns and particular attention to our issuers.
Interesting. So, I mean, a lot of those topics that you just mentioned touch on shareholder communications. Pierre, maybe you could share a little bit about how SES tackled their communications with shareholders and perhaps other stakeholders during the thick of the crisis.
Okay. Thank you, Monique. So indeed, that was the biggest challenge we faced, was the organization of the GM. Throughout the year, we communicate with our shareholders via a dedicated email address, shareholders@ses.com. So there's regular emails coming in. All of that is normal business. We try to reduce the sending out of the documentation to a minimum by having earlier in the year dedicated mailing to our shareholders to see whether they would accept receiving all the information digitally rather than having a big paper file. So we tried to save some trees from being cut down. That reduced the administrative part ahead of the AGM. And then with regard to the meeting itself, in our articles of association, it stated that the meeting is held on the first Thursday in April. That made it the 2nd of April this year. The convening notice was in the papers 30 days before, in early March. So early March, it wasn't clear yet what would happen. The virus had been around in some European countries. First measures had been taken in Italy, in Spain, but in Luxembourg, it was still business as normal, business as usual. But it was clear that something would come. And so I anticipated what would come by speaking to our external counsel, getting legal advice on what the possibilities would be, so that when on the 20th of March, the government came out with regulations that allowed us to be flexible and hold the AGM, even if it was not part digitally, even if it was not included in the articles, we were ready. And on the 20th of March, the deadline for shareholders to register for the AGM was coming to an end. So on the 21st, we got in touch by email with all the shareholders that had decided they would come to the meeting. And some of them registered for the meeting still on the 18th and the 19th, strangely enough. So we were then ready. We contacted them, asked them to provide a proxy to two people, the chairman and our external counsel, individually, because we said we want at least two proxy holders, just in case that one of them would not be available, because you didn't know whether they would fall in ahead of the AGM. And in the same mailing, we sent them the voting certificate, asking them to send those in advance as well. And we asked them whether they had any questions. We committed to answering the questions during the meeting, but we said there will also be possibilities to ask questions during the meeting. We came in to test, and we said we would hold the meeting via WebEx, and we gave them a number of phone numbers that they could use for that. We did not show them the slides during the meeting, given that they had received all of the information ahead of the meeting, digitally or on paper, depending on their status. And we came in to test all of the phone numbers, the WebEx system, and so on. 4 or 5 days before the meeting, found that one of the phone numbers was not working, made sure we got another communication to the shareholders. And then when we were to start the meeting, we couldn't connect. Although we had tested everything, same number, same people, same room, same microphones, it didn't work. And the chairman had to use his mobile phone for the first 10 minutes of the AGM, and then from one moment to the next we were in and everything worked out fine. We had more questions than usual during the meeting, so it lasted a bit longer. I think overall we all agreed that the AGM was a very successful AGM, and we probably got the highest number of questions that we ever had during an AGM.
It's really interesting. It's also particularly the last point about the highest number of questions that you've received during an AGM. I mean, there's a lot of initiatives to increase engagement with shareholders and with stakeholders. And having more remote meetings, given that especially with listed companies, that the shareholders are dispersed across the world. It sounds like a good thing. Yeah. Do you think you will do similar next year or in future, or are there barriers legally or culturally to that?
For the first thing, of course, is that we will look at changing the articles, possibly. We'll probably review the articles overall and see whether there's other things we might want to change. But I could imagine that we would organize an EGM to give us more flexibility in the future. Obviously, that involves a lot of organization and a lot of costs, because in our case, we need to publish invitations in 3 different international newspapers and so on. So we need to check whether it's worth doing. But for example, I could imagine that we would organize an EGM to change the articles concurrently with next year's AGM, and then take it from there. I think shareholders still appreciate the possibility to come to Vetstov and meet directly with directors, because I have the impression that a number of shareholders like to come, if only for the lunch after the AGM, because it gives them the possibility to ask questions they might not ask in a bigger room, and meet with both senior management and directors. So I don't think we would limit future AGMs to digital AGMs, but I could imagine that we could possibly combine the two.
So possibly with the physical meeting with the larger shareholders coming, or those who are coming from not so far, and perhaps smaller shareholders, etc., dialing in or following it online.
I think it would be the other way around. It would probably be the local shareholders are the smaller shareholders. They would probably come, and the larger ones would dial in.
Or send their proxy. Interesting. I don't know, Paula, if you have thoughts on that. I mean, again, just coming back to the point that the stock exchange is this large bond exchange, and bondholders have meetings as well. Anything change there with the bondholder communications, or thoughts for future on that respect?
Sure, it's very interesting, and just a couple of thoughts. Actually, as Pierre said at the beginning, listed companies and companies not listed actually were impacted, and Luxembourg Stock Exchange actually as a company was also impacted, and our general meeting this year was kind of different, and we all had to adapt to this new situation, and we don't know actually yet how long it will take. If it's actually temporary, if next year we need also to apply the same, special or exceptional digital approaches. But actually, it brings us to a very interesting discussion about shareholders' engagement and digitalization. I think this will be a topic afterwards, but actually it's interesting to see how hard has been the discussion about shareholder engagement. And from a legal perspective, we had, for example, in 2007, the first shareholders' right directive actually to provide and to promote shareholders' engagement. It didn't work as it was expected. We now have a shareholders' right directive 2, to even increase this engagement, and it's not sure actually how it will work. And now, suddenly with this crisis, as actually Pierre describes correctly, we had actually an increase of these shareholders in engagement. So there are opportunities from the crisis, and it's actually very interesting to analyze it. And also, from the perspective of Luxembourg Stock Exchange and our core corporate governance principles, actually more than ever, our principle 10 on shareholders engagement and the recommendation of having active communication to shareholders is key for the functioning of listed companies.
Thanks. You mentioned the shareholders' rights directive there, so maybe it's a good time just to ask Paula. This came into force last year, the second version of it in Luxembourg. What was new? What changed as a result of that?
So as I said, the main principle is actually to have a more long-term perspective regarding the functioning and objectives, targets of the companies, and increase engagement of shareholders into the business of the company, increasing the relationship of all the stakeholders, intermediaries, investors, and shareholders and directors of the company. So basically, the directive, which was transposed into Luxembourg jurisdiction, really wanted to harmonize key concepts, key definition has shares, the concept of shares, the concept of shareholders themselves, and also harmonize the process of corporate actions. So as Monique, as you said, actually the directive, the law was published last year, and it will be fully applied actually this September, when some key EU delegated acts will be entered into force. But interesting to see is that last week a working group, the high-level forum on capital markets union, which was a group of experts set up by the European Commission, which discussed actually how the CMU, so the Capital Markets Union, could actually be a success, which it's not yet the case. It's interesting to see that one of the recommendations of the group was precisely on the shareholders' rights directive. And the group is actually proposing the Commission to transform this directive into a regulation. Why? Precisely because, and we observed that there are still an enormous inconsistencies amongst different member states regarding the definition of shares, the definition of shareholders, which is actually a huge obstacle to the implementation of voting rights across the EU and EU member states, and in particular when we have multinational companies actually in the EU. It's important to have really consistent, coherent definitions and concepts, which actually it's not necessarily the case when we have directives, which actually allows member states to transpose and make several interpretations, which in most of the cases are not actually the same in all member states. So a regulation could actually help to have, I don't like to use the word unified because it's very federalist concept, but still a more consistent approach regarding key legal concepts, which could actually help voting rights and management of corporate action. So let's see how the Commission will take those recommendations from these working group. So to be seen, but I expect some modifications.
Thank you. Thank you. Pierre, so the 2019 accounts were the first ones to include certain aspects of these new provisions from the Shareholder Rights Directive 2. You know, were there particular challenges? We know that some of it will only come into force, you know, next year, but did you already apply some of these new aspects?
Yes, we had to apply, of course, the law. And the aspects that concerned us the most were the aspects with regard to the remuneration. It was the remuneration report and the remuneration policy that needed to be submitted to a vote in the AGM. It's both were approved, but it were the 2 points that were approved by the smallest margins. They were still in the 70s in terms of percentage in favor, but that were the more controversial topics. In particular, the directive is not very clear on who's covered by the remuneration report and by the remuneration policy. What's the definition of a director? It's and we checked before we drafted the report, we checked with legal counsel, not only ours, but also we had a major discussion between other listed companies in Luxembourg and how they interpreted it. We checked what other countries consider as directors in this context, because, for example, it's clear that the management committee or the executive committee should be covered, but would they need to be covered individually or not? The rules are differing from country to country. So we decided to give more information than in previous years, but I'm sure there's other companies in other countries that give more information, and that probably led to some of the major shareholders voting against the report and the policy because they felt it was not giving enough information. At least that were the messages that we got from proxy advisors. But we gave more information than in previous years, and we felt it was easier to give more next year than if we gave more information this year and take a step back the following year. So I think that will be a topic where in the coming years we will see more transparency and more details emerging. And that's something that we were clearly aware this year when we published those reports, which are available on our website, as we need to make them available as per the new law. So.
Okay, interesting. So coming back to the crisis and other new trends, I mean, at EU level, we have the EU Green Deal, we have obviously Paula at the Stock Exchange, the Green Exchange. So there's a lot more focused here on ESG and on non-financial matters. You know, are these an opportunity? Are these difficult to deal with? Perhaps starting with you, Paula, and the Green Exchange. You want to tell us a little bit about sort of the thoughts behind that and where you've come with it?
Absolutely. So basically, the topic of green is actually not new for us. Luxembourg Stock Exchange listed more than 10 years ago the first green bond issued by the EIB, the European Investment Bank. But then the topic actually is becoming more and more important, and we had key landmarks at international level as the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, then the adoption of UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and in actually 2016, Luxembourg Stock Exchange launched the first green platform, the Luxembourg Green Exchange, to actually help and facilitate the development of the green bond market. In the meantime, the European Commission actually thought that, and the European Union thought through the European Commission that it should actually have played a role into the discussion. In particular, because nowadays there are several, standards, again, different definition concepts of what is green or what is actually not green. And it's key actually to speak the same language. And when I'm actually talking about same language, it's not English or French, but actually speaking the same technical language, actually to understand what is a green bond, what actually defines green. And so actually taking a step back, in 2016, the Commission set up a high-level expert group where Judy Becker, our deputy CEO, was a member. And after that, based on the recommendations of the high-level expert group, the Commission prepared an action plan on sustainable finance, and immediately after actually proposed what is now, actually it was published yesterday in the official journal of the European Commission, the taxonomy regulation, meaning a classification of what should be considered actually environmental related activities to actually provide market participants with clear and certain definition and concepts to build trust, to provide comparable information, or to provide reliable information for the market to strive. Actually, this is the part of the ESG, so the E on the discussion about sustainable finance. Social actually was residual. What the crisis is actually showing us is that social bonds actually are now key stars in the sustainable finance discussion. We are observing in the market an increase of companies choosing social bonds actually to finance some specific projects related to COVID-19. And to be honest, I think again this will be an opportunity to actually build a potential framework, a potential taxonomy, a classification of what should be considered or not social. Because as you know, in the past and currently, we talk about some greenwashing, and the future we can talk about social washing, and we really want to avoid this kind of misleading behavior in the market. So I strongly believe that the discussion about ESG can actually be accelerated, in particular on the S of the discussion. Currently, there is ESG, the EU Green Bond standard. There is a public consultation on the EU Green Bond standard, and there are discussions whether those high-level general principles, which actually applies to the EU Green Bond standard, could be mirrored to a potential EU social standard actually to promote the market. At the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, actually, just a final note. We wanted to help, even if it's a small help, our issuers, which actually decided to list those specific social bonds, and we actually waived the fees related to the listings of COVID-related bonds, which in the market actually are labeled as social bonds.
Thank you. Interesting. And Pierre, at SES, what are you also seeing there in terms of ESG and how these things are impacting perhaps how the board is approaching different aspects of the strategy or engagement?
So for the moment, we have not issued a green bond yet, although we are obviously financing our company through bonds as well, but we have not gone that in that direction yet.
Yet. It's nice to highlight the yet part.
Exactly, and I wouldn't exclude it. But
right.
It's clear that the board wants to be involved more in terms of ESG. So we have the obligation as part of our non-financial information to publish a dedicated report or give more information in the annual report. That's also a topic we are building up. We have published a dedicated report both last year and this year. We involved the external auditors to make their specialists to make sure that we were in line with our legal obligations, but investor relations is focusing more and more on the ESG communication when they are discussing with stakeholders. Internally, there's also initiatives to promote any such initiatives. Internally, for example, there's one project that is now going in the direction of the S. We have a project called Giving Back, where we allow our employees to take off a few days per year to give back to the communities in which they are living, and the company is sponsoring that. So we have other initiatives where we double donations that are made and so on. So it's clearly something that will be growing as we go on.
Thank you. So Paula, I mean, a lot of the communications with shareholders, stakeholders, when we're talking about ESG, relates to the non-financial aspects of reporting. Mm-hmm. And the directive that was transposed into Luxembourg law applies to listed companies. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that directive, and then perhaps what that might mean in due course for unlisted companies as well?
Sure, absolutely. So basically, this directive was approved in 2016. It was transposed into all member states. It actually covered large public interest companies. The scope is actually quite limited, and again, this is a directive quite high level. It actually does not provide a specific standard, a specific recommendation on that. It was transposed into Luxembourgish law in 2018, and in the meantime, actually due to the priority of climate and all the environmental issues, the Commission published in 2019 specific guidelines on climate-related disclosures under this directive, which, as you know, are non-mandatory, so as guidelines, but the intention was to provide the companies with more specific and targeted guidelines on those issues. It's interesting to see that the CSSF published the first report on this topic, and actually the results are not brilliant. At least CSSF actually highlighted some topics that would be important to be improved in terms of these disclosures. Interesting also to note is that this directive, precisely because it's too general, too high level, and actually it lacks some more concrete obligations, unfortunately, to companies. This directive is being reviewed. Earlier this year, the Commission published a public consultation to precisely launch an assessment of this directive and how this directive could be more efficient. Under this public consultation, we can already assess potential directions for a potential review of this directive. And I would stress, for example, the scope of the directive. The Commission is asking whether not only listed companies, but all companies should be under the scope of this directive. Also, whether a common standard for the reporting should actually be provided by the directive. And interesting, and along the lines with the Shareholders' Rights Directive, actually whether this should not be actually a regulation, precisely to have a direct effect in all member states equally, avoiding plate or different approaches from different jurisdictions. Just as a final note, two final notes. First, in 2018, the stock exchange actually prepared and published our ESG guides, actually precisely to help not only companies listed with us, but also issuers which actually have securities listed with us and asset managers, to help all these stakeholders on their ESG disclosures. So the guide is on our website and actually is a toolkit for all these stakeholders to prepare and to design their reporting ESG obligations. The final point is actually to highlight that actually Luxembourg Stock Exchange, without being a listed company, wants really to be part of the discussion and be subject to the discussion. And we are extremely proud that that Luxembourg Stock Exchange actually prepared its first sustainability report, also to provide the market an example and leading as an example for best practices on ESG discussions.
Interesting. Pierre, anything to add there on the non-financial disclosures, or any of them that were particularly hard to quantify?
No, except that I think the burden of disclosure will only go in one direction. I think we'll see more and more disclosures, more and more transparency in the coming years, whether listed or not.
So maybe, sorry?
I think simply the stakeholders are looking for more information.
Okay, great. And so in Luxembourg, another source for creating transparency and good governance within listed entities is, of course, the 10 principles of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. This was last revised in 2017, and Pierre, you were chairing actually the working group for that revision of the 10 principles. Do you want to walk us through a little bit? What were the key updates in 2017? And, is it right for review? Are we looking forward to a new edition soon?
Yes, indeed. We reviewed it. So once established, we regularly reviewed the 10 principles. In 2017, the revision was simply the major revision was to introduce a new principle for RSE matters or RSE, ESG, it all goes in the same direction. So there was a clear view that any listed company should follow these principles. We had to make sure we found 2 principles that we could merge if we wanted to stick with 10 principles. We managed to do that, so it's now principle 9 that is dealing with RSE matters. Given that the last revision was in 2017, we are now in 2020, we are very likely to see a revision of the current version in the coming month. I had a discussion with Paula from the stock exchange, and we will probably launch a revision after the summer, depending on how big the revision will be. We might want to publish them still this year or early next year, that depends, but I think we will see a new version in the coming months.
Thank you. And Paula, you know, I'm aware that the stock exchange sort of monitors the compliance with the 10 principles of the listed companies and engages with them on where they have challenges or to being able to apply them or where they seem to be not applying them in a consistent manner across different listed companies. Would you be able to share your thoughts on, you know, where are those challenges to applying the 10 principles, or also for the stock exchange or for stakeholders in monitoring how companies follow them?
Sure. Yes, as Pierre said, so we not only review the principles on a regular basis, but also we track on an annual basis the implementation of those principles by all companies which have shares listed on our regulated market. So we see that there are always room for improvement, in particular regarding some information on special committees, lack of information on special committees, gender diversification is also important on boards. There are some missing information regarding disclosures of the management structure. So there are room for improvement. We need actually to analyze the last reports, in particular the implementation of the Principle 9 on CSR obligations. It's actually under analysis, and we are curious to see actually how companies dealt with these new principles. So need to be checked and monitored.
Thank you. So I guess maybe I can just, I've got some of the poll results up on screen. So the one that's showing there at the moment is about the non-financial information. And interestingly, people were not, a little bit mixed, but not too worried about the differences in the assurance requirements between the financial and non-financial information, i.e. that the non-financial is not audited. So it seems that people are quite happy to, with where that's going, and not necessarily thinking that the audit requirement is a prerequisite. I'll put up some of the other results. There you go, you can see them. So the first poll was about the lack of comparability, reliability and relevance, and whether these are considered to be critical to the non-financial reporting. Here again, pretty mixed, but most people saying that, to some extent that these are critical, and that, so obviously comparability would, and some sort of common standards would be welcomed in future. And then I'll stop sharing that one. And the last one was the AGM poll. And so there you'll see, actually people were pretty mixed about whether or not they would be more likely to attend an AGM if it was held electronically, or whether it would influence them at all. I thought that was quite interesting, because I thought that people would attend more, especially distant meetings, but yeah, pretty mixed there on whether they would like to or not. Obviously nice if they're given the opportunity. So coming back to Paula, Pierre, we are coming to the end. Audience, you haven't asked any questions in the chat channel, so very quiet in there today. So last chance to ask questions if you do, through the chat channel. But otherwise, Paula, Pierre, we can sort of start wrapping up. What are the lessons learned from, recent evolutions in legislation, directives, etc., for listed companies, and also just from more recently the crisis?
Well, I can start. Well, I would just, to summarize it, I would highlight three main topics. First, transparency. Second, digital. And third, the social element of the ESG. On transparency, I think it's a key element of capital markets. Listed companies, non-listed companies, on a pandemic situation or not, actually transparency is key. And actually, if companies communicate with their stakeholders, shareholders, bondholders, actually it's key for the functioning of the company itself and the market as a whole. The second one is the digital part of the business. I think actually the pandemic situation that we are living showed that digital tools are key, not only for the AGMs, but also regarding the way employees and all the board members communicate with themselves. And actually, we didn't stop. No one stopped on financial markets, and we are here actually based on those digital platforms. So this can pose some risks in terms of cybersecurity, for example, but it can also bring some opportunities actually for the business. And then the social part, as we discussed, the social part of the ESG discussions. Actually, if 2 or 3 months ago, environmental, climate, green issues and green bonds were actually the key players in the market, we now see a shift towards social instruments, social security, social bonds, which can actually accelerate the discussion on specific frameworks, specific standards, which can help the market to build trust and to know more and to use more those instruments in order to finance their projects.
Thank you. Pierre?
Yes,
Final words?
I would like to take 2 points. The first one is indeed the ever-increasing importance of transparency, which I see more in terms of more ESG reporting being required from stakeholders, and where ILA has been focusing on the G. Recently, more there has been a focus on the environment, and I think we will see in the future more focus on the S in ESG. And one of the conclusions I would draw from the crisis is that, and that's independent whether it's a listed company or not. I think the company needs to make sure it has and it continues to have access to financing, whether that's for shares or whether it's for bonds or loans. It's not necessarily because it exists on paper that it's available when you need to draw down, and so that's an area where I think but that's more for the management of the company. But if the companies need or want to survive, they need to make sure that that's available at all times, because I think that's the biggest impact I see from the crisis right now.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Paula and Pierre, for this great discussion. I think we've had, some great insights into topical issues facing directors and boards of listed entities. It sounds like with the EU delegated regulation coming, the second level regulation coming out later this year, and possibly updates to the 10 principles, that we'll be back towards the end of the year looking at listed companies again. Thank you as well to the audience. ILA will post the webinar online shortly, and we'll follow up with the summary as well in due course. The next coffee chat will be next Wednesday, 1st of July, where we'll be presenting a new guide being published by ILA, which is a Vademecum tool, which is for helping directors and boards to navigate through times of crisis. And obviously, then if you check the website, you'll see also the series of strategic corporate sustainability webinars, which are ongoing, as well as other events. So thank you again to our panelists and to all of you listening. And we look forward to hearing you all and having you tune in next week. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.